The rain fell steadily against the windows of the Sony Music Studios in New York City on the evening of November 12, 1991, creating rivulets that caught the neon lights from the street below and painted abstract patterns across the glass like tears of innovation waiting to be born. Inside Studio B, the most technologically advanced recording facility in the world, Michael Jackson sat hunched over a collection of computer monitors, circuit boards, and prototype devices that looked more like the laboratory of a mad scientist than the workspace of the king of pop. The room hummed with the quiet energy of electronic equipment, punctuated by the occasional beep of digital processors and the soft scratch of Michael's pencil as he sketched diagrams that would, unknown to anyone present, eventually revolutionize how every human being on Earth would consume music. The studio was nearly empty at this late hour, with only Michael and a small team of engineers who had signed confidentiality agreements so comprehensive that they joked they couldn't even tell their wives what they had for lunch. Among them was Dr. James Chun, a brilliant computer scientist from MIT who had been recruited not to work on music, but to help Michael explore an idea that had been consuming his thoughts for months. Chun sat surrounded by experimental hardware that Sony's research division had provided, equipment so advanced that it wouldn't be commercially available for another decade, watching with fascination as the world's most famous entertainer demonstrated an understanding of digital compression algorithms that rivaled that of trained computer scientists. Michael had become obsessed with a problem that seemed to have no solution in 1991. He had been touring the world for decades, witnessing firsthand the hunger that people in remote villages, isolated communities, and economically disadvantaged areas had for music, for connection, for the art that could transcend language and cultural barriers. But the reality of music distribution meant that millions of people would never have access to the songs that could change their lives, never hear the melodies that could heal their hearts, simply because the physical infrastructure didn't exist to get vinyl records, cassette tapes, or compact discs to every corner of the globe. What if, Michael had said to Chun during their first meeting 6 months earlier, his voice carrying that distinctive whisper that became more pronounced when he was deep in thought, what if we could compress music so much that it could travel through telephone lines, through any kind of communication network, so that someone in a village in Africa could hear the same song as someone in Tokyo at exactly the same time, without needing a record store or a radio station or any physical object at all? The engineers had initially dismissed the idea as impossible. The technology to compress audio files small enough for transmission over existing networks would require processing power that didn't exist and algorithms that hadn't been invented. But Michael possessed something that the technical experts lacked: an absolute refusal to accept that human limitations should determine the boundaries of human possibility. He had spent months studying computer programming, teaching himself the basics of digital signal processing, reading technical journals until his eyes burned with exhaustion, driven by a vision of a world where music could flow like water, reaching every person who thirsted for it regardless of their geographic location or economic circumstances. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks earlier, during a session that had lasted until dawn, when Michael suggested an approach that combined multiple compression techniques in a way that no one had previously considered. Instead of trying to preserve every nuance of the original recording, what if they could identify and preserve only the elements that the human ear could actually perceive, discarding the rest as unnecessary data? It was a concept that required not just technical knowledge, but an intimate understanding of how humans experience music, how the brain processes rhythm and melody and harmony, knowledge that Michael possessed in abundance from decades of creating and performing. The prototype they had developed was crude by later standards, a collection of jury-rigged components that looked like it might fall apart if someone sneezed too loudly, but it could compress a 3-minute song into a file small enough to transmit over a standard telephone modem in less than 10 minutes. To put this in perspective, the fastest music transmission available to consumers in 1991 required specialized equipment and took over an hour to send a single song. Michael's system represented a compression ratio that the industry had considered impossible. "Play it back," Michael said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machinery. Chen's fingers moved across the keyboard, and suddenly the studio filled with the opening notes of Billie Jean. But this version had traveled through Michael's compression algorithm and back, transformed into digital data, and reassembled into sound waves that seemed to carry all the emotional impact of the original recording despite having been reduced to a fraction of its original size. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the continued patter of rain against the windows and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. The engineers stared at their monitors in disbelief, checking and rechecking the data to confirm what they had just heard. Michael leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing across his lips as he watched their faces register the magnitude of what they had accomplished together. "This is going to change everything," whispered Dr. Sarah Martinez, the audio engineer who had been skeptical of the project from the beginning. "If we can make this work reliably, if we can build systems around this technology, music will never be the same. Distribution, access, the entire industry infrastructure, all of it becomes obsolete overnight." Michael nodded slowly, but his expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "The question isn't whether we can do this," he said, standing and walking to the window where he looked out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. "The question is whether the world is ready for what this means. We're not just talking about making music easier to share. We're talking about democratizing access to human expression, about making it possible for an artist in one part of the world to instantly connect with listeners everywhere else, about breaking down the barriers that have always existed between creativity and audience." The implications were staggering, and as the months passed and the team refined their system, those implications became increasingly clear. This technology wouldn't just change how music was distributed. It would fundamentally alter the relationship between artists and their audiences, making it possible for creators to bypass traditional gatekeepers and reach listeners directly. Independent musicians who had never had access to recording studios or distribution networks would suddenly be able to share their work with global audiences. Remote communities that had been culturally isolated would gain access to the musical traditions of every culture on Earth. But Michael also understood that this technology could be misused, that it might make it easier for music to be stolen rather than purchased, that it could disrupt an industry that employed millions of people around the world. He insisted that any implementation of the system include robust protections for artists' rights and mechanisms for ensuring that creators would be fairly compensated for their work. The team spent as much time developing security and payment systems as they did perfecting the compression algorithms themselves. The secret project continued for nearly 2 years, with Michael financing the research through a shell company that gave no indication of his involvement. He wanted the technology to be developed and tested thoroughly before revealing it to the world, understanding that premature announcement could either kill the project through industry opposition or lead to inferior implementations that might damage the concept's potential. The team grew to include economists, lawyers, sociologists, and ethicists, all working together to address the complex implications of a technology that could reshape human culture. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories about the hidden innovations that changed our world forever. By early 1993, they had developed a working system that could compress, transmit, and decompress audio files with quality that was virtually indistinguishable from the original recordings. They had created software that could run on ordinary personal computers, protocols for secure transmission over existing networks, and even early versions of what would later be called streaming technology, allowing people to listen to music as it was being transmitted rather than having to wait for complete downloads. Michael made the decision to reveal the technology during a private demonstration for music industry executives in Los Angeles, a gathering that he arranged under the pretense of discussing future album releases. The audience included representatives from every major record label, heads of radio networks, technology companies, and music distribution systems, people who controlled how music reached consumers around the world and who stood to lose the most from a fundamental change in distribution methods. The demonstration took place in a conference room at the Beverly Hills Hotel, with Michael standing beside a simple computer setup that looked unimpressive compared to the elaborate audiovisual systems the executives were accustomed to seeing. He began by explaining his vision of universal music access, describing villages in Africa where children had never heard recorded music, urban communities where poverty made purchasing albums impossible, isolated populations where geographic barriers prevented cultural exchange through art. What you're about to hear, Michael said, his voice carrying the same quiet intensity that had driven him through 2 years of research and development, is a song that was recorded in this hotel room 5 minutes ago, compressed using new technology, transmitted to a server in Tokyo, and sent back to us here in Los Angeles. The entire round trip, including processing time, took less than 30 seconds. The executives shifted in their seats, clearly skeptical that any meaningful audio could be transmitted so quickly over such distances. Michael pressed a button on the computer, and the room filled with his own voice, singing an impromptu version of The Way You Make Me Feel, recorded with studio quality despite the improvised performance, and transmitted around the world in the time it had taken him to introduce the demonstration. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Record executives who had built their careers on controlling the physical distribution of music realized instantly that they were witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely new. Technology representatives began furiously taking notes, recognizing that this system would require massive infrastructure investments and create opportunities for entirely new types of businesses. Radio broadcasters understood that their monopoly on music transmission was about to be challenged by a technology that could make every personal computer into a potential radio station. Michael watched their faces as the implications sank in, seeing excitement, fear, opportunity, and resistance all competing for dominance in their expressions. He had expected this reaction and had prepared for it, but experiencing it firsthand was still overwhelming. He was watching an entire industry realize that the fundamental assumptions underlying their business models were about to become obsolete. This technology, he continued after the music ended, will be made freely available to any company or organization that agrees to use it in ways that expand access to music rather than restricting it. We're not interested in controlling this innovation or profiting from it directly. We want to see it implemented in ways that serve artists and audiences, that make music more accessible rather than more expensive, that create opportunities for creativity rather than barriers to it. The months that followed were a whirlwind of negotiations, technical partnerships, and legal frameworks. Michael worked with technology companies to refine the compression algorithms, with record labels to develop new business models that could function in a world of instant global distribution, and with international organizations to ensure that the benefits of the technology would reach developing nations rather than being limited to wealthy markets. The first commercial implementation appeared in 1995, though Michael's role in its development remained secret for several more years. The technology became the foundation for what would eventually be called MP3 compression, digital music distribution, and ultimately streaming services that would make it possible for any person with an internet connection to access virtually any song ever recorded. The algorithms that Michael and his team developed in that New York studio became the invisible infrastructure underlying how billions of people experience music every day. But perhaps the most profound impact was exactly what Michael had envisioned from the beginning: the democratization of musical expression and access. Independent artists could suddenly reach global audiences without needing record label support. Traditional music from remote cultures could be shared and preserved digitally. Young people in economically disadvantaged communities gained access to educational and inspirational content that had previously been beyond their reach. The barriers between musical cultures began to dissolve as artists from different traditions could easily hear and learn from each other's work. Years later, when the technology had become so ubiquitous that people took it for granted, Michael would sometimes visit internet cafes in remote parts of the world, watching young people stream music from artists they would never have heard of in the era of physical distribution. He would see children in rural schools using the same technology to access educational content, elderly people connecting with family members across continents through music sharing, isolated communities maintaining their cultural traditions by digitally preserving and sharing their musical heritage. The secret project that had begun with Michael's frustration over the limitations of music distribution had evolved into something much larger, a tool for human connection that transcended geographic, economic, and cultural boundaries. The technology made it possible for a street musician in Mumbai to influence a composer in Stockholm, for a gospel choir in Alabama to inspire a pop group in Japan, for musical traditions that had been geographically isolated for centuries to suddenly become part of a global conversation about rhythm, melody, and meaning. In 2009, shortly before his death, Michael finally publicly acknowledged his role in developing the compression technology that had become the foundation of digital music. The revelation came during an interview that was itself distributed using the very systems he had helped create, reaching millions of people simultaneously around the world. He spoke about the responsibility that comes with innovation, about the importance of developing technology in service of human creativity rather than corporate profit, about his dream of a world where access to art was limited only by curiosity rather than circumstance. The interviewer asked him what he was most proud of in his career, expecting him to mention his albums, his performances, or his humanitarian work. Instead, Michael spoke about receiving letters from young musicians in remote areas who had been able to share their music globally for the first time, about elderly people who had reconnected with musical traditions from their youth through digital archives, about the hundreds of thousands of independent artists who had built careers using distribution methods that hadn't existed when he was starting out. Music, he said in that final interview, his voice carrying the same whisper that had launched the secret project nearly 2 decades earlier, was always meant to be shared. The technology we developed didn't create anything new. It just removed the barriers that were preventing music from flowing to the places it was meant to go. Every time someone discovers a song that changes their life, every time an artist reaches an audience that appreciates their work, every time music creates a connection between people who might never meet in person, that technology is fulfilling the purpose it was designed for. Today, as billions of people carry in their pockets devices capable of accessing virtually any song ever recorded, as musicians in every corner of the world can instantly share their creations with global audiences, as music continues to serve as a universal language that transcends cultural and linguistic barriers, Michael Jackson's secret innovation continues to shape how humanity experiences and shares artistic expression. The compression algorithms he helped develop have become so fundamental to digital communication that they're built into the infrastructure of the internet itself, making possible not just music streaming, but video calls, online education, telemedicine, and countless other applications that depend on efficient transmission of audio and visual information. The small computer setup in that New York recording studio, cobbled together from experimental components and held together by vision and determination, had grown into a global network that processes billions of musical transactions every day. But the most fitting monument to Michael's secret project isn't found in any museum or technical specification. It's found in the moment when a child in a remote village hears their first symphony, when an isolated artist discovers they have an audience on the other side of the world, when music creates connections that geography had previously made impossible, proving that some innovations are measured not in technical specifications or profit margins, but in the number of human hearts they touch and the barriers they help humanity overcome.